The stories. The librarian who reopened maps after one voicemail. The voicemail hit the library phone system at 9:16 in the morning, and staff noted the time on the call sheet. The town's map room had been shuttered since 2016 for budget reasons, with the keys sealed in a gray envelope. Rhea Calder was 38 and worked as a reference librarian, and she was supposed to weed duplicate travel guides. She liked lists and quiet projects that finished by closing time, and she intended to be home before the streetlights switched on. She opened the staff mailbox for routine messages, and the new voicemail had a subject line that looked wrong. The timestamp matched today, yet the voice sounded grainy and old, like cassette tape found in a hot attic. The caller sounded rushed but clear, and he used a steady dispatcher tone that carried through the static. He said the emergency detour map in the bridge packet had its north arrow wrong, and the Depot Road turn would strand drivers. He named 2 intersections locals would recognize, and he said the paper copy got flipped during a late-night duplication. He asked whoever heard this to check the flat files in the public map room, and then he hung up fast. Rhea paused because the library was planning a small display for the bridge reopening next week. The town crew wanted visitors to see old blueprints and printed maps, and the staff had quietly promised to unseal the room. She replayed the message and wrote down every location, and she typed the intersections into the library catalog notes. The bridge packet sat behind the desk in a manila folder, and she slipped the detour sheet out with a quiet tug. The detour looked normal at first glance, and the label fonts matched the county style guide. The north arrow pointed toward the top of the page, and a thick red line wrapped through 3 turns like a ribbon. She looked for a small staff stamp, and there it was near the border in faint purple. It said copied from firehouse drawer after warehouse incident, which the old reference notebook linked to 2009. Her job and training lived in the overlaps between paper and people, and she felt the old itch to confirm. The warehouse incident had clogged the streets for days, and archived calls reportedly mentioned bad directions at least twice. She brought the folder to the workroom and pulled the microfilm drawer, and the metal slides rasped against old paint. Dispatch logs on film listed closed streets and detours, and operators marked trouble points with pencil circles. 2 logs from the same night mentioned Depot Road, and the note said trucks turned the wrong way toward the river. One line said, "See temporary detour plate beside flat file B," which sounded like a direct breadcrumb. Flat file B waited in the locked room behind the genealogy shelves, and the envelope with the keys lived in a safe. She signed a paper acknowledging responsibility for access, and she carried the keys with both hands like a relic. The map room smelled like dust and linen, and the ceiling fan ticked from a loose blade. She slid open a drawer and found rolled sheets, and brittle plastic sleeves stuck to their neighbors like leaves after rain. The temporary detour plate was a stiff board with a taped photocopy, and someone had written "mirror warning" in grease pencil. The north arrow had a big X over it, and a second arrow pointed to the right side with the word "up." She spread the board on a table and placed washers on the corners, and the paper fought to curl back into memory. The Depot Road turn looked reversed compared to the packet, and the red line as drawn would lead drivers into gravel. Her phone compass showed north toward the windows, and the temporary plate matched her reading within a few degrees. The packet map disagreed by a wide margin, and her stomach tightened like it always did when details misbehaved. She printed a recent aerial photo from the county website, and she centered on Depot Road and the bridge approach. A water tower shadow ran northeast by the clock, and that matched the plate, but not the packet. She called Tomas Brink, who was 54 and ran maintenance, and she asked about the packet source. He said a volunteer scanned old map holders in the spring, and staff patched labels onto the county base. He remembered a late-night copy job at the firehouse during the warehouse week, and he thought someone flipped a master. He had no hard proof, but he told her to talk with a retired cartographer who lived near the marsh. The cartographer was named Lyda Morell, and she was 71 with careful eyes and a faded canvas jacket. Lyda said she had drawn the original emergency plates on Mylar, and she always sketched north as a small star. Lyda remembered the night the plates went missing, and she spoke like a teacher marking a board after a test. The firehouse copier worked only on the legal tray that night, and someone fed the plate upside down, then pressed copy twice. Lyda said her handwriting on the board looked like her early notes, and she pointed to the grease pencil word "up." She kept a photo from that week that showed two volunteers holding the board outside, and the sun angle matched. Rhea asked if the board ever returned to the library, and Lyda shrugged like she had told this story several times. She said yes, the board came back 2 days later, and someone tucked it into drawer B and shut the room. Rhea documented everything as if the board could grow legs and escape, and she wrote dates beside each step. She took photos of the board and the packet, and she copied the microfilm lines, and she initialed each printed page. The voicemail still bothered her because the timestamp said today, yet the content smelled like an old headache. She checked the library phone system logs, and a vendor note explained a recent server migration for stored voicemail. An alert said a batch of delayed messages had been flushed to mailboxes, and the explanation used dry language and disclaimers. She asked the vendor to search for the caller number, and they returned an old service name with a billing code. The code matched a dispatch line used during the warehouse week, which explained the voice and the choice of words. Someone had recorded this warning years ago, and the system had kept it like a seed in a jar. Rhea asked if the caller name could be released, and the vendor sent a redacted sheet with initials and a job title. A local news archive matched the initials to a night guard who reportedly died of natural causes in his parked car. The guard had phoned the correction before the medical event, and he had tried to reach any desk that could fix the map. His message never reached a human while the roads were jammed, and the bad copy camped in a drawer. Rhea brought her notes to Tomas, and he carried the folder to a brief meeting with the town clerk. The clerk asked for confirmations and a plan, and Rhea offered a clear sequence that would be easy to retrace next year. Step 1 was to treat the packet map as untrustworthy and to replace it with a fresh export from the county base. Step 2 was to reconcile the arrow with on-site compass readings and to annotate with the date and the staff initials. Step 3 was to scan the temporary board and let the grease pencil speak and to place its image in the appendix. Step 4 was to add a small note in the bridge display and to credit anonymous archival materials for clarifying the route. Tomas drove to Depot Road with her after lunch, and they parked near a mailbox whose nameplate had peeled away. The river ran dull and brown beside the road, and a detour sign leaned like a tired person after a long shift. Rhea stood where the red line on the packet would have sent traffic, and she looked through cottonwoods at rough gravel. The correct route followed a narrow paved lane to the east, and the wrong turn aimed drivers toward a soft shoulder. A school bus rolled past on the narrow lane, and the driver waved like this was already muscle memory. The aerial photo printed in the morning matched the bus path, and the packet map did not. They stopped by a small clinic 2 turns away, and the nurse behind the counter remembered the warehouse week. The clinic took calls from stranded drivers, and a nurse reportedly walked out to redirect a line of cars at sundown. The town clerk approved the correction that afternoon, and the county uploaded a clean detour with verified arrows. Tomas signed off on new signs, and the bridge crew shrugged like this was just another Tuesday with wet concrete. Rhea asked for permission to open the map room weekly, and the clerk looked toward the budget with a careful tilt. The request had no funding yet, but the clerk liked the argument that open rooms produce fewer expensive mistakes. They agreed on a one-afternoon schedule under staff supervision, and Rhea posted a notice near the staircase. She placed the temporary board in a display case with a modest label, and she kept the packet map below it with a sticky note. The sticky note said obsolete and see corrected version, and she included the date and her initials for future sanity. A footnote in the display explained that a delayed voicemail triggered the review and no personal names appeared. At the reopening of the bridge, the mayor shook hands and cut a ribbon, and the appetizers ran out fast. Drivers moved through the new approach like water down a smooth bed, and the detour signs wandered into storage. Tomas clapped her shoulder near the coffee urn, and he said quiet fixes rarely get banners, which is the point. Lyda visited the display the next morning, and she pressed her fingers against the glass like she was reading Braille. Rhea listened to the old voicemail one more time, and the voice had that tired confidence that comes from night work. He had said, please check the flat files, and it felt like he was speaking across a hallway rather than across years. On her desk, she kept a small notebook with 3 lines that she repeated when projects became slippery. Write down names of things as they are used, compare them to how they look on paper, test the direction with the Sunday. She added a 4th line in light ink to mark the lesson that felt both new and as old as maps. If a voice says the arrow is wrong, Open the drawer before the parade trucks roll and the cameras arrive. In the months that followed, the room gathered quiet visitors, and the fan still ticked, but less often after tightening. Folks brought rolled plats from garages, and Rhea labeled them carefully, then scanned and returned them with fresh sleeves. A contractor volunteered 2 hours a week to help with filing, and he taught her to spot scale bars that lied. Teachers brought students to trace creeks with cotton thread, and one kid noticed a benchmark star on the courthouse steps. The bridge display came down after the season changed, and the temporary board went back into drawer B with a proper sleeve. A small typed note inside the sleeve told the story in 12 lines, with dates and initials and measured claims. It said a voicemail arrived and matched earlier dispatch references, and staff verified the arrow with compass and aerial evidence. It said a clean map replaced the packet version before the reopening, and the town's roads agreed. Rhea did not call it a miracle, and she did not call it fate, because both words would cheapen 12 careful steps. She called it library work, which sounded plain, yet it held more weight now that a ribbon had been cut. On quiet afternoons, she stood at the window where the compass had pointed, and she felt the same small pull. North was where the light made honest shapes on paper, and where a tired voice could still find the right room. When she locked the door each week, she thought about the man who made the call, and she wished he had been heard. His warning crossed an odd gap in the system, and it landed like a folded note slid under a door. In a town where stories often arrive secondhand, the plain ones sometimes carry the longest mileage. One message, one board, one arrow corrected, and a room reopened so a drawer could be opened without ceremony. The stories. A final call was traced near that bridge. Late in the evening of October 5th, 2016, a storm rolled through a quiet stretch of countryside. Wind battered the old bridge over Hollow Creek, shaking the steel rails and scattering leaves across the asphalt. Around 10:32 p.m., dispatch logs show a brief, incomplete 911 call pinged off the nearest tower. The caller's voice was male, panicked, and cut off mid-sentence. Investigators later marked the audio as simply unresolved. The man behind that call was named Leon Price, 43, a long-haul truck mechanic from a nearby industrial town. He'd spent the day finishing a repair job for a delivery company, planning to drive home to his wife in time to watch a recorded game. According to coworkers, Leon left the shop around 9:40, saying he wanted to check something quick before heading home. That something was never explained. By morning, Leon's truck was found parked near the old bridge, headlights off, and driver's door locked. His phone sat on the passenger seat, the last number dialed being emergency services. The call duration? 12 seconds. No sign of a struggle. Just the smell of damp metal and mud, and a faint drag mark leading toward the railing. Search teams spent 3 days combing the area. Divers worked the shallow creek, drones scanned the woods. Nothing. Local papers speculated everything from suicide to abduction, but investigators leaned toward an accident. Maybe he'd slipped trying to inspect something under the bridge. Yet the coroner never received a body, and the case sat open as missing, presumed dead. His number mens in spix. Years later, in 2021, a city engineer named Rachel Kearns was reviewing archived bridge inspection photos for a maintenance report. In one image, taken 2 days before Leon's disappearance, a reflection caught her attention. The photo showed the lower truss beam standard shot, but in the corner, faintly lit by a maintenance flashlight, there was a silhouette of a man crouching. The timestamp placed it around dusk on October 3rd, 2 days before Leon vanished. The engineer who'd taken the photo, retired since, confirmed no one else was scheduled to be on site. Rachel forwarded the image to the county sheriff's office, and they reopened the file. Investigators re-examined Leon's work records, tracing his calls and texts from that week. One stood out. A message to a contact labeled BR sent the afternoon of October 5th. It read, asterisk, I found it, meeting at the bridge tonight. Asterisk, the number was prepaid, never registered, and disconnected within 48 hours. A detail in the message puzzled detectives. Leon wasn't known for secrecy. His wife, Dana, told them he'd been bothered for months by something from an old job, saying he'd done work he wasn't proud of for a client that refused to pay. Dana assumed it was a parts dispute, but when she mentioned a box Leon kept locked in his garage, the investigation shifted. Inside the box, police found a spiral notebook filled with maintenance records dating back to 2009, all logged under a defunct company name, Midstate Transport. Midstate had folded after a fatal trucking accident that same year, a crash investigators blamed on faulty brake lines. In a note scrawled at the back of Leon's notebook, he'd written, asterisk, proof they used counterfeit parts. Need photo evidence. Asterisk. The handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if written in haste. Detectives contacted the National Highway Safety Archive, which confirmed that a whistleblower had anonymously submitted similar claims in 2009, alleging that Midstate falsified inspection reports. The case was dropped for lack of evidence. The archived whistleblower email was traced back to a generic account created under the name LP. That bridge where Leon's final call was traced? It connected two counties where Midstate operated their delivery routes. According to old GPS logs, the crash that ended the company happened less than a mile from the same spot. Investigators brought in a retired dispatcher, Marvin Blake, who'd worked the radio the night of Leon's disappearance. He remembered something odd. Just after the 911 call ended, the system registered another incoming line static, then silence. It was like someone else tried calling from the same tower seconds later, he said. But the system flagged it as unregistered equipment, like a test signal. The telecom technician reviewing archive data found that the second call's source ID matched an obsolete analog handset, one last sold around 2010. Its signal strength placed it not on the bridge, but 30 yards downstream, near a maintenance access path. Detectives returned to the site. Flood levels had receded since 2016, revealing a rusted toolbox half buried in silt beneath the bridge. Inside were several brake components, a corroded camera memory card, and a name tag, price L. The photos recovered from the card showed close-ups of serial numbers on parts stamped with counterfeit manufacturer codes, exact matches to those listed in the old Midstate case file. Forensic analysts reconstructed the final minutes of Leon's life through phone tower data and ambient audio from the recovered memory card. The recording suggested he'd been documenting the parts, likely intending to turn them in as evidence. Rain intensified, wind roared, and a loud metallic creak echoed the sound, consistent with a vehicle crossing the bridge above him. Seconds later came a splash and muffled crash. The last image on the card showed Leon's flashlight beam turned toward the creek bank, and in the background, a dark SUV partially visible through the guardrails. Authorities attempted to trace any vehicles on that bridge during the window of time. Traffic cameras from the nearby highway ramp were down that night due to the storm, but one motion-activated wildlife camera a mile away captured taillights heading east around 10:35. The model matched an SUV owned by a former Midstate executive, Brent Rowan. When questioned, Rowan denied being anywhere near the area, stating he'd sold that vehicle years prior. Records later showed the SUV's title transfer occurred 2 months after Leon's disappearance. With no physical remains and no eyewitnesses, the district attorney declined prosecution. The case was again marked unresolved. Still, among investigators, the consensus hardened that Leon Price had gone back to finish what he'd started years earlier to expose falsified safety records that cost lives. He'd arranged to meet someone that night, someone who realized too late what evidence he carried. In early 2022, bridge maintenance crews discovered a piece of phone casing embedded in the concrete ledge beneath the guardrail. Lab tests confirmed it matched Leon's model and contained trace data from his final call. The last GPS ping aligned within 3 feet of where the toolbox was found. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man burdened by guilt tried to make something right. He gathered proof of wrongdoing, arranged a meeting, and never came back. The evidence he left behind, notes, photos, the final call, spoke louder than any statement could. Dana Price still visits the site once a year. Locals say she leaves a small brass key on the railing, Investigators believe it's the key from Leon's garage lockbox, the one he'd used to hide the notebook that reopened everything. The bridge stands quiet now, repaved and monitored by new cameras. Every so often, a maintenance crew reports interference on their radios when crossing after dark. A faint echo that clips mid-word 12 seconds long, always the same. Officially, the file reads, "Case closed, pending further evidence." Unofficially, among those who worked it, the belief endures that Leon Price's final call wasn't a cry for help, but a handover. A man trying, in his last breath, to trace the truth back to where it first broke. The stories. This highway turnout kept a secret roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind-scoured and sun-bleached, the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with 2 flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed "Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it." The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a 2-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night. Reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast, like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Ivo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once, like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling. Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, a kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle. She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late-night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor, because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched Late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, two figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Evo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the crews twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Evo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names, and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when two vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Ivo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors, he still swept glass after fender kisses, he still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plants. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, "Two trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called." It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, camera angle improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile, and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause. The cabin door that never opened in Hoonah, Alaska. Locals in Hoonah still mention a cabin off Port Frederick where a door reportedly refused to open during a search. The story circulates in marina talk and winter gatherings when icy straight winds push boats against the floats. People repeat details from memory and clipped reports, then pause when the timeline begins to blur. They say nothing supernatural happened, yet the door remains the problem everyone avoids naming. The central figure was 47, a maintenance carpenter named Richard Vale who came to Hoonah for seasonal repairs on public cabins. He carried a tidy set of tools and a habit of writing dates on masking tape inside hinge plates. His stated goal was simple work and steady pay, while his brother managed their mother's treatment in Juneau. He rented a room above the harbor office and paid cash for fuel and dry goods. According to archived notes at the city office, neighbors saw Richard wheel a cart of lumber down the boardwalk on a Wednesday. The weather held bright and cold, with early ice clinging to the shaded rocks along the shoreline. He loaded the skiff before noon and told a harbor aide he planned to check a cabin up Port Frederick by evening. The aide reportedly reminded him about a predicted squall that might arrive after nightfall. Dispatch logs from that week show routine calls for ferry coordination and a stranded truck near Game Creek. Richard's name appears once with a simple request for weather, then the line ends without a follow-up. State records list his seasonal permit and a recent renewal for small engine fuel storage. No citation or complaint mentions him before the date the cabin door enters the file. A fisherman named Caleb Norton, 58, told friends he saw a skiff hugging the inside of Crab Bay that afternoon. He pointed to a notch where wind lines rarely flatten, suggesting the operator knew how to steal quiet water. The timestamp on his phone camera places him on the float when the skiff left the harbor. Some locals claim the man at the tiller wore a bright cap, though investigators never confirmed the color. The cabin sits back from a narrow cove where spruce hides most of the shoreline from passing eyes. Its porch faces southeast and catches thin light after noon when the tide pulls weed from the rocks. Records conflict on who last signed the logbook before Richard, and the ledger paper shows a rip that obscures a date. A county file from 2009 references a similar repair visit with no noted issues. 2 days later, a guide reported a skiff tied clean at the cabin float with the bowline doubled. The fuel can sat upright and dry, which usually means no scramble during landing. The porch steps showed shallow scuffs that looked like work boots rather than soft camp shoes. A hammer rested near the threshold with tape labels cut into neat strips. When the guide tried the door, he told officers it would not open past an inch at the latch. He felt no chain, but something firm stopped it before the inward swing could clear. The windows were closed and filmed with salt, but showed no obvious shapes inside. Investigators later wrote that pry marks were absent and the hinges looked normal from the porch. A wildlife officer named Hannah Ruiz, 33, reached the site after a short run from Whitestone Harbor. She logged light surf, weak rain, and a steady outflow that pushed the skiff sideways at idle. Her notebook says the latch plate aligned true, and the strike pocket showed no splinters or shims. She wrote that sound carried strangely in the trees and seemed to return from the far bank after each shout. They removed the hinge pins and tried to lift the door straight, which should release a standard interior catch. The slab rose a thumb's width and settled again as if trapped beneath by a weight. Hannah recorded that the floor gap showed only darkness and left her uncertain if a rug wrapped the threshold. Investigators never confirmed the presence of furnishings beyond a small table noted in older maps. A second attempt used a slim wedge to feel the interior space, guided by a small light and careful hands. The wedge met resistance that felt like stacked boards or a cabinet pushed flush, though measurements failed to agree. Some locals claimed a new cabinet had been delivered that week, which warehouse staff later denied. State records include no invoice for that item under Richard's seasonal account. They circled the cabin and checked every window frame for pry damage or fresh putty that might suggest an interior brace. One corner showed a streak that looked like boot rubber near the sill, leading back toward the steps in a faint arc. The ground held little shape because rain had erased crisp edges across the duff and needles. Archived notes mention a single nail in the dirt as if dropped during fastening work. The skiff carried Richard's tool crate with tape labels on nearly every handle and bit. Inside lay screws, sorted by length, and a folded sheet with hinge spacing drawn in pencil. The sheet uses block letters and short words that match notes found in his bunkroom ledger. The ledger mentions a plan to replace a warped slab if the existing door failed the swing test. Hannah radioed the harbor and asked for permission to breach the wall if a medical check demanded entry. The dispatch reply reportedly advised caution because ownership paperwork listed multiple agencies with overlapping rights. They decided to leave the structure intact until a supervisor could reach the site with written clearance. That delay is the piece that people return to when they discuss what happened next. During the pause, a weather line pushed down Icy Strait and dropped sleet across the cove until evening. The boats sat heavy at their lines and the shoreline disappeared behind a sheet that blurred the trees. A loud crack came from the porch like a board shifting under new pressure inside. Caleb later told friends the sound carried across water in a clean way he did not expect from wet wood. When the team finally entered the cabin, they did not use the door that prompted the call. They took a panel off the rear wall where an old vent had been sealed with light screws. The interior smelled of resin and cold ash from a stove that held no visible ember. Notes describe a floor swept clean and a cot made with square corners beneath a wool blanket. The obstruction proved to be a cabinet frame set tight against the latch side with shims that pressed the slab inward. The frame showed careful cuts that matched Richard's tool marks and tape labels for orientation. A finish nail still held a piece of blue tape with a handwritten arrow pointing toward the jamb. The tape carried a pencil line that read "Test swing only," which introduced the hardest question in the report. If Richard built the frame for a test, he needed a partner to release the pressure from the outside when he finished. The notes do not show a second worker on the schedule, and marina staff remember no one riding with him that day. Some locals claimed he trained a part-time helper earlier that month, but investigators never confirmed a name. Records conflict on whether a volunteer crew worked that week on nearby structures. A folded jacket hung behind the stove with a badge from a Juneau supply shop sewn near the cuff. Inside a pocket, they found a receipt for fasteners and a small envelope containing 3 screws shorter than the others. The receipt date reads early in 2019, and the vendor stamp matches Richard's earlier purchases. The envelope shows a faint smear as if handled in the rain before drying on warm metal. They checked the shoreline for signs of a second skiff that could have ferried a helper away after dark. The tide range that week was broad and wiped many edges clean between morning tides. A plank floated against the weeds with a staple at one end and pieces of blue tape stuck to its side. Caleb believed it belonged to the cabinet frame, though the cut length did not match easily. The cabin journal waited on the table with 3 lines that appear in Richard's careful hand. The first lists hinge spacing and a reminder to check swell along the bottom edge before planing. The second notes a stiff turn at the latch and a light bind he planned to measure again after tea. The third reads, "Door doesn't open and stops short at the margin without a period." A day later, a private pilot reported a lone figure near the mouth of Game Creek carrying a coil of line. The sighting time sits close to dusk when the flats take color and distance grows hard to read. The pilot reportedly radioed a brief note, then banked toward Teneke before weather closed the gap behind. Investigators never confirmed the figure's identity, and the area held no clear prints the next morning. State records show no bank activity on Richard's account after that week, and his room key remained on a nail. His brother came from Juneau and stood on the dock while officials summarized the findings from a short clipboard. He asked whether the doorframe could trap a person by accident if a shim slipped under load. The answer in the file reads unlikely, but does not fully exclude a rare bind if weight shifts after pressure. A volunteer searched the shoreline toward Spassky and found a glove caught in alder a short walk from the cove. The glove matched the brand in Richard's crate, but showed different wear along the thumb where tape leaves residue. Some locals claimed the glove looked left-handed and too small for his grip. Investigators never confirmed whether Richard owned a second pair stored in the bunkroom drawer. County file copies include a note from 2009 describing a temporary brace for a door that stuck in spring. The brace used scraps and marked measurements similar to the recent cabinet frame that blocked the latch. The old note says "remove before occupancy" in small letters with a circle drawn around the line. The circle looks faintly like Richard's habit, though the comparison is not considered conclusive. A weather station near the mouth of Port Frederick logged a short spike of gusts on the night of the first delay. The spike coincides with the loud crack reported from the porch during sleet and falling light. Technicians wrote that siding can flex under wind and shift an interior frame a fraction that changes pressure. That explanation sits in the file beside the question of who would place the frame so precisely. When the cabin reopened months later, the door swung true after planing and a fresh coat across the slab. The cabinet pieces were stacked neatly under the porch with labels still holding to their edges. A ranger added a line to the interior log, asking future workers to avoid test braces near active latches. Visitors still run a palm along the jamb and say the swing feels heavier than it ought to feel. Richard's name remains on a list of unresolved disappearances linked to coastal communities scattered across the archipelago. The list contains notes about boats, short flights, and quiet trails that meet the water before turning inland. Officials keep the file open and accept tips that reference times and places rather than theories. People in Hoonah speak evenly about such things and prefer facts that fit inside a ledger line. Some nights, the harbor grows very still and voices travel from the fuel float to the last finger pier. A deckhand will point toward the dark shape of Port Frederick and mention the door that started with a simple test. The older hands will nod and explain that wood moves when weather presses long across the grain. Then the talk returns to ordinary work while the cove lies quiet behind the trees. The stories. Why this librarian reopened a cold map drawer. In late September of 2014, the Quiet Town Library off Route 47 got a new head librarian named Corinne Ashland. She was 39, a former archivist who'd spent years cataloging geological surveys for a state university. By all accounts, Corinne wasn't the kind of person to chase ghosts until the day she decided to reopen an old, locked map drawer that everyone else had forgotten. The drawer sat in the basement stacks, labeled Time State Topography 1952 to 1958 asterisk. Its brass handle had gone dull with age, and the key was missing. For years, staff used the cabinet as a makeshift table for coffee mugs and boxes of donations. But one morning, while rearranging a shipment of donated atlases, Corinne noticed a faint rust-colored smear near the label. It looked like dried clay or maybe iron dust. Either way, it didn't belong there. She mentioned it to her assistant, and he laughed, saying, "That drawer's cursed. Ask Mrs. Langley. She swears a surveyor disappeared working on those maps." Corinne smiled politely, but something in her stayed hooked on the idea. She asked around. The drawer dated back to when the building served as a records annex for the county planning office. In the mid-50s, several regional floodplain studies were stored there before the files were relocated or supposedly relocated to the state archives. No one ever verified that. When Corinne checked the archive's digital inventory, she found gaps. 4 missing surveys, all from the same year, 1957. They covered a stretch of riverland that was later condemned for a hydroelectric project that never materialized. That evening, Corinne used a universal key set kept for restoration work and opened the map drawer for the first time in decades. Inside were rolled parchments bound with cotton strings, their edges yellowed. Beneath them, she found a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside the box lay a water-stained notebook, a compass with a cracked lens, and a faded photograph of two men standing beside a field the size of a football stadium, ringed by survey poles. On the back of the photo, someone had written, asterisk, last day before the dig, GM asterisk. Corinne scanned the initials against old employment rosters. There was a Gregory Malon, a field engineer who'd gone missing in June of 1958. Officially, he'd left the project for family reasons, but the local paper from that summer told a stranger story. Asterisk, surveyor vanishes near proposed reservoir site. Search suspended after 3 days. Asterisk, no follow-up, no body recovered. Corinne started a file. 1. She called the county records department. A man named Leland Cross, an aging clerk who'd worked there since the 70s, remembered something. Mahlan. Yeah? He was working on the Franklin Bend plan. Whole thing got shelved when the funding dried up. I heard his partner quit soon after. Leland didn't recall the partner's name, but he mentioned an old storage trailer the county once kept near the riverbank. They hauled the trailer out after a flood in the 60s, he said. If anything survived, it's in the historical depot now. The depot was just a few miles away. Corinne drove there that weekend, signed in as a researcher, and requested the Franklin Bend materials. The clerk brought her a warped cardboard box smelling of mildew. Inside were soil samples, invoices, and a reel of magnetic tape marked Audio Log 4 field notes. She had to borrow an old player from the depot staff. The recording was faint, but clear enough to recognize two male voices. Asterisk, Greg, you're not logging this, right? Asterisk. Asterisk. Relax. It's just us. But if this ridge keeps sinking, we need to report it. Asterisk. Relax. Relax. Asterisk. Asterisk. We will. After the last survey, the company can't afford another delay. Asterisk. The tape ended with wind noise and a scrape, like a microphone hitting dirt. Corinne replayed it 3 times, listening for landmarks. At one point, one of them mentioned mile marker 12 and the culvert by the sycamores. Using digitized topographic maps, she traced those features to a narrow bend along the river, now fenced off as private land. When she brought this to the local sheriff's office, the deputy shrugged. If you're talking about Mahlan, that case is older than my dad. We can't go digging around on private property for a rumor. But Corinne wasn't chasing rumor. She was following evidence. She emailed a geologist friend from her university days, Dr. Theo Ricks, who specialized in landslide patterns. Theo ran a ground-penetrating radar survey along that same bend under a research permit for soil erosion. The data showed a deep subsidence pocket about 20 feet from the current riverline, consistent with an old collapsed tunnel. Theo sent her the printout and a note, asterisk, you might have just found their camp trench. Asterisk. They returned together a week later. Theo handled the radar equipment while Corinne recorded the coordinates. Near sunset, a small piece of metal surfaced from the silt, a corroded survey tripod leg, stamped Property of Franklin Bend Hydro Limited. The find was modest, but it confirmed the crew had worked exactly where she predicted. From that point, Corinne began piecing the timeline. The notebook from the tin box mentioned sudden soil shifts, pressure readings, and the phrase asterisk, map variance, river shift, not natural. Asterisk. The handwriting was Malan's, matching samples from his earlier reports. It appeared he suspected someone had deliberately diverted a drainage channel to falsify flood risk data, possibly to inflate land value before government acquisition. If true, exposing it could have derailed the whole project. The company had millions at stake. Mahlan filed his last note 2 days before he vanished. Corinne cross-checked the company records and found the corporation dissolved in 1961, right after a quiet lawsuit settlement with an undisclosed party. No public record linked it to Mahlan. But tucked inside the notebook's back cover, hidden beneath the lining, she found a short letter addressed to M.R. Hanley, attorney at law. It never got mailed. The ink was blurred but readable enough. Asterisk, they moved the stakes. If anything happens, check the revised map in drawer C. It's the only truth left. Asterisk. Drawer C was the one she'd opened. By early winter, local journalists picked up her findings. The county authorized a limited excavation, mainly to verify the historic maps. When workers dug near the subsidence pocket, they uncovered remnants of an old metal barrel containing drafting tools and fragments of canvas. Among them was a wristwatch, glass shattered, still faintly engraved, asterisk GM, asterisk dental fragments. Nearby, later confirmed Malan's identity. The discovery didn't just solve a missing person case, it revealed a quiet cover-up. The original floodplain data, preserved in those maps, showed the river was unstable long before developers planned the reservoir. Ignoring it had likely saved the investors short-term losses, but cost one man his life. The county issued a formal acknowledgement of error, though no one alive faced charges. The land was later rezoned as a conservation area. Corinne kept working at the library, though people now came from all over asking about the librarian who solved the map mystery. She never took credit beyond saying she just followed what was left behind. The old drawer was cleaned, cataloged, and displayed behind glass with the tin box and the compass inside. Every so often, she'd unlock the case to polish the brass handle, and she'd think about Mahlan's note, the way he wrote times the only truth left, asterisk. She understood now that archives aren't just about paper or ink, they're about the things people try to bury, and the few who still choose to look. By the next spring, the library basement smelled of fresh paint. The drawer sat quietly in its corner, again, cool metal against the hum of fluorescent lights. And that was enough. No headlines, no dramatics, just a reminder that sometimes reopening the past isn't about curiosity. It's about letting someone finally be found. The stories. Dispatcher, who redialed a night number years later. The call that woke the overnight desk never finished cleanly, and the number that hung up stayed burned into memory. The report marked it as an incomplete welfare check request, and the audio ended right after a sharp breath. Leora Vance worked nights at a regional communications center, 36, steady voice, quick notes, routine coffee. She covered a patchwork of small towns around a river, and her goal that night was simple and ordinary. She wanted to make it through the shift with clean logs, then drive home before sunrise. At 2:43, the line flashed unknown number, and a woman whispered that somebody was on the porch. The voice cracked like cold glass, and static clipped the rest, so Leora asked the normal questions. The call died mid-sentence, and the return attempt fed a busy tone that rolled like a slow alarm. Protocol said, log it, dispatch a unit, and move forward with the map. She sent 2 cars across county lines, and she wrote porch contact unknown female, possible prowler, audio cutout. The officers found a silent street and a door light, and the porch camera showed only a moth. The address did not match the call trace, which often happened with rural switches. The closest relevant record was a break-in from 1998, and the same street used to be named differently on paper maps. The officers cleared without contact, and Leora filed it under incomplete with a notation on poor signal. She replayed the clip during the quiet hour before dawn, and she heard a faint tone behind the voice. She had a habit of catching tiny sounds people missed, and she logged them like breadcrumbs for later check. The tone matched the alert from older medical pendants, according to an equipment chart in her drawer. 2 days later, the number could not be connected, and the carrier reported a recycled pool of lines. A supervisor closed the incident, as resolved by patrol presence, and life returned to the ordinary rhythm of alarms and traffic. Leora drove home through thin drizzle and told herself to let the record settle. Years slid by with new software and different chairs, and Leora moved into training and quality checks. She taught new dispatchers to separate panic from facts and to trust logs more than late-night adrenaline. She kept a notebook of unresolved lines, a quiet ledger of what the radio called ghosts. In 2005, a county audit required purging old tapes, and Leora requested the call as a training sample. She argued that the tape showed how to verify address data when signals bounced, and the review board agreed to preserve it. She placed the audio in a folder for classroom use, then forgot it for a while. In 2017, the center switched to digital recording with automatic transcription for flagged words. The legacy folder ported into the new system, and the software saw porch and pendant, then tagged it for quality review. Leora listened again and heard the same faint tone, which still felt wrong and unfinished. She noticed a rhythm behind the static, and it repeated every 6 seconds with small variants. A trainee suggested a smoke detector chirp, but the pattern felt too mechanical for a battery warning. Leora wrote a new note, and she marked it as likely device signal not from residents. A retired technician stopped by for coffee and heard the clip through an open speaker. He said the beeping sounded like a hallway alarm from a care facility, and the pitch matched certain wall units. He gave a rough model name from years earlier, and he shrugged in that cautious way field techs learn. Witness statements in older town council minutes mentioned a small facility that closed in 2006. The building sat at the edge of a service road near the river, and the license lapsed after staff shortages. The address never showed in the dispatch mapping tool, which favored current businesses and active residences. Leora searched archived calls around that road and found short bursts from unknown lines that year. Each clip cut off before a name, and the patrol responses found nothing but chained doors and dust. A maintenance crew had watched the property for a bank, according to one officer report from Spring. She pulled tax records from the county site and found a change of ownership in 2007. The building title shifted to a holding company, which often meant redevelopment, which never came. A satellite photo showed a roof with patched squares and a light pole that leaned toward the access lane. The night number from the porch call mapped to a carrier block once used inside institutions. A policy note in an old binder described internal extensions that could overflow to outbound lines when certain failsafes trip. It was not proof, but it lined up with what the technician had described over coffee. She visited the records room on her lunch and requested dispatch logs for that road after 2006. The clerk pulled a slim folder with dust, and the sheets listed trespass checks requested by neighbors. No violent incidents were recorded, and most notes referenced animals and teens daring each other. A faded memo said interior power was cut to code years ago, and alarms were disconnected with a certificate. The memo was initialed by a contractor who later moved out of state, according to a local paperclip. The paper mentioned a minor zoning fight over repurposing, which stalled and faded. A rumor in a neighborhood forum referenced late-night lights near the loading door, reportedly seen by a delivery driver. The driver claimed to hear a tone like a distant truck backup, and then nothing after he blinked his high beams. The forum thread ended with jokes, and the administrator locked it after a week. Leora requested permission to run a courtesy check by phone on the legacy carrier block. She wrote that the new system showed occasional pings from inactive numbers, and she wanted to verify with the provider. The provider sent a bland letter that said non-billable pings could reflect maintenance checks, which proved little. She let it go again until 2021, when a cold storm knocked power around much of the valley. The center fielded hundreds of calls for downed lines and trees, and unknown numbers flooded the switch when cell towers failed. The old number flashed across a test screen, and a note in red tagged it as historic. It hit her in the middle of managing a pile of alarms, and she felt the odd gravity of unfinished work. Her trainee, a quiet analyst named Mateo Greer, saw her stare and asked what history followed that line. She explained the porch call, the tone, the closed facility, and the recurring pings during outages. He suggested a careful redial during low traffic hours, which fit policy when no private party would be disturbed. The number technically did not belong to a person, and the facility was listed as vacant in tax files. The watch commander noted no risk and approved a controlled test with recording flagged as training. At 3:10 the next night, Leora sat with Mateo in a side room and pressed redial on a clean console. The ring returned at a low volume, and a relay clicked before a voice picked up with a machine crawl. The voice said, "Reception desk. Please hold." The line stayed open with air and faint humming. Leora spoke carefully, and she used the generic script for a wellness verification at an inactive site. The line did not respond like normal interactive voice response, and the hum rose then settled like heating vents. Mateo pointed to the waveform on the screen, and he traced a stair step that pulsed in threes. She said the center needed to verify status for a safety audit, and could a staff member confirm the building as empty. The voice returned with a single word, and it sounded like census, which made no sense for a desk. The hum changed to a thinner tone, and something clicked like a phone being set down. They stayed quiet, and a tiny echo carried an off-room sound that resembled elevator chimes. The building never had an elevator, according to the old permit in the zoning files, which listed 2 floors only. The chime could have been something else, or a bleed from another source through a carrier trunk. The call lasted 2 minutes, and then a hard click ended it with no final acknowledgement or goodbye. Leora logged every detail with exact time and the conditions of the room, plus the fact that a second console witnessed. She wrote that the voice felt recorded, but not like a standard system recording from that era. A next step followed policy, which said request a daytime site check with property access if possible. The sheriff office called the management company, which reported that the interior phones were long removed with certification. A maintenance vendor met deputies at noon, and the group entered through a side door with a stubborn hinge. They found clean air, paint flakes, and a smell like dry paper after long storage. No phones sat on desks, and no wiring hung from ceilings beyond bundled tubes cut and capped. A panel in the back room had a line of dead indicators, and a label from 2006 named the contractor. A back storage closet held a metal cabinet for telecom terminations, and inside a single light glowed green. The maintenance vendor said the light probably fed from a battery pack, which should have died many years earlier. He pulled the pack, and the light stayed green, which made him raise his eyebrows without a word. They traced the last live wire through conduit to a junction box near the loading door by the ramp. The box led to an old underground line that likely connected to a central office by the highway. The vendor said a ghost loop could be holding a stub signal, which might ring when jolted by storms. The explanation fit enough to calm nerves, and it gave the watch commander a line to give any curious council member. Leora filed the daytime result and waited for the routine to end, but her notebook felt heavier than before. She wanted something cleaner, a line that tied the porch call to a person. She checked archived calls for names near the facility in late 2005, and a surname appeared twice. The name belonged to a kitchen worker who reportedly stayed late to clean and who left town soon after closure. A short article from a community paper mentioned a farewell potluck in a church hall. A social post from years later showed a small photo of a medal on a refrigerator and a caption about nights that never end. The account had poor privacy settings, and it linked to a page for a caretaker group that offered mutual aid. The group had a public list of contacts, and one number matched the surname. She called during the afternoon from a staff phone and explained she was a dispatcher reviewing a historic alarm. The woman who answered identified herself as the former cook, and she said the night phones were a mess back then. She remembered plugging a line into a wall to ask for help during a snow night, then hanging up fast. The year matched the period before closure, and the memory included a porch light that never switched off correctly. The cook said a hallway alarm sometimes tripped when wind hit the wheelchairs stacked near an exit door. She said a pendant kept calling the desk after the resident moved, and staff joked about it. Leora asked if anyone had used an emergency night number taped under a desk, and the woman hesitated, then said maybe. She said an old laminated card listed a direct outside line for after hours when the main switch froze. She added that the card got lost during a water leak, and the sticker glue ruined 2 drawers. The detail matched a photo in the zoning files that showed bubbled plywood under a window near the desk. The water issue provided another path for odd faults, which could keep a line limping and ring when power fluctuated. The cook promised to look through an old box for any scraps, and she promised nothing more. Days later, an envelope arrived addressed to the center with no return, and inside lay half a laminated card. The text read, "Night number for direct line. Use only if house phones fail." The bottom showed 6 digits with 2 missing. The plastic edge was cracked, and a brown stain cut through the second line. Leora held the fragment near the recording console and felt the story settle into a shape that made sense. The porch call likely came from a staffer trying to poke through a dead switch, and the tone was the hallway alarm. The number carried forward through bureaucratic leftovers, and it rang when the storm hit the loop. She still needed the humane piece. The person whose whisper said someone was on the porch that night. She checked weather records for a cold snap that matched the reported snow night, and the timeline met the audit note. A dispatch log from the same week showed a trespass call at a different address with no contact. The officer who filed that trespass had retired to a nearby town, and he answered his landline on a sunny afternoon. He remembered a night when snow fell like ash and radios kept picking up carrier noise. He also remembered stopping near the old facility entrance, then leaving after seeing only footprints of a stray dog. He did not remember any porch lights, but he said the small homes nearby sometimes used helper bulbs that never slept. He also said staff from the facility used to walk to a bus stop at 4 in the morning after night shifts. The whisper could have been a staffer leaving alone, worried by a shape on the ramp. The theory fit and did no harm, and it honored the boundary between records and stories. Leora wrote a final entry into the training file, and she summarized the chain of evidence with careful language. She used reportedly, and dispatch logs and witness statements, and she added the laminated card as a scanned appendix. Before she closed it, she redialed the night number 1 last time to satisfy the part of her that wanted symmetry. The line clicked into a dead tone for 3 slow breaths, then released a single chime in silence. She sat still, then pressed stop and saved the recording with a title that matched her steady heart. She did not post about it, and she did not share more than the classroom frame. The work of nights is often this quiet, a puzzle solved just enough to let people sleep. On her drive home, she watched a porch light fade behind a tree line and let the road carry the rest away. The Bridge Collapse Files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with 2 north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing two distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the South Bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and 2 fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross-sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return.